Hey everybody, it's me. Welcome to this week's live chat. I know it's been a couple weeks. Sorry for that, but I'm glad to be here today. 2 weeks ago, I was in the Villages, Florida, soaking up the beautiful sun, teaching a wonderful group out there, an amazing quilt guild. I had a blast, and actually there was quite a few people at the guild that watched the live chat, so that was kind of fun. And then last week, I was under the weather. It was kind of like ending the challenge, go to Florida, Super Bowl, about had a heart attack, and then the parade and all that stuff. So it's just been a crazy couple weeks, but so thankful for the people that have difficult jobs so that I get to do this really fun job. I feel guilty about it sometimes, but I just love talking to you all, so it's a great time. In this week's live chat, I'm going to be talking about needles and kind of going over that, and then next week we'll talk about thread, and we'll bring it all together with tension tips and how to deal with those thread issues. So it's kind of a two-part live chat. But as always, Jessica's behind the camera. Now that I say that, we did have some requests that they want to see Jessica, so next week, Jessica, you're going to have to let them see you. Make sure you know she's real. Anyway, so if you're watching live, you can type your questions out. She'll give those to me at the end. If you're not watching live, no worries. I know it's kind of a weird time of the day. You can always leave them in the comment section, and I get on there from time to time to answer it. So the videos stay live until then. So this summer, I had the opportunity to be the kind of wasn't the keynote speaker, but I was at Handy Quilter Academy kind of as the featured guest. And Handy Quilter is the brand of long arm that I use, that I was an ambassador for and now a dealer for. So I love the company and really close with them. And it's the second time I've been able to be like their featured speaker. The first time I was out there, they gave me a pretty amazing gift. I have to show it to you. Some giant Handy Quilter scissors. These puppies are amazing. They actually work. They're legit scissors. And they're also like a personal defense thing. And they come with a cute little case, so that was a nice little gift. And then this summer, they gave me a gift that made me squeal out loud. So I can't wait to show it to you. I'm sure you might be able to guess what it is. It's a giant needle. Now, I have said on my live chats before that, I really wanted a big needle so I could do all the illustrations and kind of show it, and they had somebody make it for me. So fitting that, again, I have a giant needle, really cool, also can be used as a personal defense thing, but it does help me illustrate the parts of a needle and why it's important to know them. I can totally geek out on thread, needles, and tension. I could talk forever about it. I won't because I don't want to bore you, but it is super important to understand the parts of a needle so you can understand why choosing the right size of a needle is important and why putting it in the correct way is important. So I do have some pictures. I know it's kind of hard to see this, but still pretty amazing. If I could, I'd wear it around my neck like jewelry. But when we're looking at our needles, and you're probably pretty familiar with a lot of the parts. The eye, of course, is where the thread goes. That's where the thread feeds into that bobbin area. But you might not notice that there is a long groove in the front. What this groove does is it protects the thread as your needle's going through the fabric. If you think about the process of sewing and quilting, it's pretty amazing that it can even do it at all, and that really the process hasn't changed in over 100 years. So this groove is super important because it keeps the thread from fraying. We'll talk about that here in a second. On the back of the needle, though, there's also what's called like, I don't know, it's called a groove, not a groove, it's basically like a cutout where the needle or the hook catches a thread. So in my kind of weird way, where this little scarf is, that's what it is, that scarf is where a hook catches that thread and makes the stitch. So that little indent leaves just enough room so the hook and the bobbin can grab that thread. This is important to know because if you put it in backwards, it won't have that space. We'll talk about that as well. And then of course we have the shank at top. The shank is what holds that needle into our machine. And this is technically a long arm needle because it has a round shank, as we can tell. Sewing machines have a flat shank, which are really nice because they'll only go in your machine one way. On a long arm, not always the case. So depending on what machine you're using. Then of course we have our point. So there's different points. I'm not going to get into all that, but there's ball points and sharp points and some different options there. But my favorite needle for a sewing machine is the top stitch needle. And so these are just some packages. You can see what that looks like. Top stitch needles are shaped just like this, except they have a longer eye. That eye is a little bit more stretched out to give the thread just a little bit more room to move through. It has a nice sharp point. It's great for piecing and quilting, and it's titanium coated, so it can handle the stress of quilting, longer. According to Superior's website, they last 5 to 8 times longer. And it's really important, especially when we're learning how to machine quilt, because we're putting a lot of pressure on that needle. If you think about when we're sewing, the feed dogs are grabbing the fabric, we're only moving in one direction. There's not a lot of stress on the needle because we're always just going the same way. But when we start machine quilting, whether it's on our long arm or our sewing machine, we're going in a lot of different directions and we're putting stress on that needle, especially when we're newer to it. Like if you think about learning that process, you're not moving as smoothly as you should. You're kind of maybe jerking on it a little bit. So that strength, that strong needle really helps it stand up a little bit longer. So I do have some pictures, of course, to show, and we can see a little bit of an illustration of what this looks like right up close. So again, that groove at the front is what protects the thread as it's going through your fabric, and then the eye of the needle. And on the back, there's that scarf, which is very, very important. So if you're working on a long arm and you have that round shank and you can put your needle in any direction, you may have put your needle in backwards. In fact, if you've done that, congratulations, you're completely normal. That happens to all of us when we're learning. But remember, that scarf gives room for the thread to be grabbed by that hook. And so if it's not there, it can't grab the thread. So if you've ever changed your needle and you can't pull up your bobbin thread, that could be what it is. Now, again, on a sewing machine, not so much a problem because, we have that flat shank that will only let it go in one way. Now, I do want to pause and say, always refer to your manufacturer's instructions. This is general advice about needles and a little bit of information about tension. This is kind of help give you like the primer, but check with your manufacturer. So for instance, if you have Handy Quilter, use Handy Quilter long arm needles. If you have a different brand, definitely use whatever they suggest. So knowing the size or the parts of our needle, the size of those changes depending on the size of the needle, right? So it's so great because it's a very common question that people will ask, what size needle do I use? Or what size should you use? And it depends on the size of thread that you use. So depending on the size of the needle, the eye will be bigger and that groove on the front of the needle will be bigger as well. So if you think about it, a nice, thick, chunky thread is going to need a little bit more space to go through the eye of that needle. It's going to need that little bit bigger groove. I like to kind of use the example jeans, right? If my body's a little bit bigger, I need some bigger jeans to put on there. And so same as if it's smaller. Now, one common thing that I thought when I was first starting out, like, why not just get the biggest size needle and run all your threads through it? Well, that groove is meant to kind of protect it and keep it straight. And if it's not there, it can kind of get a little sloppy. So that's why it's important to make sure your size needle is perfect for your machine. Now, Superior's top stitch needles, they come in 4 different sizes, but there's also an assortment pack. So if you want some more information about that, you can click the link in the description box. One thing I want to talk about, though, when we're talking about the size of needle, is there's not a standard weight definition of thread across the industry. Isn't that fun? That means a 50 weight cotton thread by one brand might be thicker than a 50 weight poly thread by another brand. And next week, I'll geek out on thread and tell you exactly why. So it's easy to have a range, but just know that you might have to fine tune that as you go. So for instance, and here I'm going to click back to the camera. For instance, if I'm working with a really fine thread, we're talking like 60 weight, 100 weight, very fine, tiny threads, we're going to go with a 70 needle, right? That's going to be the perfect. It's going to have the eye that's the right size for that, the groove that fits it. It's going to be perfect. But as we go up, or as we go down and up in number, thicker thread, if we get to the 50s and the 40s, then we're going to use a different size needle. Now, you can always check the needle manufacturer and they'll give you the exact size to use. But we know I love glide thread, right? And we'll find out why next week. If you've watched my live chats, you already know why. But it's a 40 weight thread. Well, I know that a 40 weight thread works in an 80 or a 90. So knowing what size needle to use with your thread is super important. And we're going to talk about, different tension things next week and really kind of dive into it. But just know that it's kind of a starting point. So for instance, if I'm using a 40 weight thread and I'm using my 80 needle and maybe I'm getting a lot of shredding at the eye, that could be a good indication that maybe the thread is a little too thick for that needle and I might have to go up in size. So again, there's no there's rules, but there's room to finagle within that. For instance, on a long arm, a 16 or an 18 needle works for glide thread. And so kind of just depending on the 40 weight that you're working with. Again, I know it's like super granular and it's kind of silly, but I love to talk about it. And then here we can see the formation of the stitch. This will really help you if you kind of get an idea of how the stitch is formed. It really helps you understand the changes you need to make when you're having thread issues or tension problems. So we can see here that scarf is coming down. It's creating this little loop so that we can grab it with the bobbin or the hook in the bobbin. Very, very important. If you ever hear somebody say, my machine is out of time, all that means is that scarf is not where the hook is at. It's in the wrong space, and we need to retime them so they match up together. That's such a fraction of a second. Like, it's not a lot of time. So again, it's pretty crazy that it could even make those stitches regardless. So again, if you're on the long arm, make sure you have it in the right direction. Make sure your needle is inserted correctly for both machines. Of course, referring to your manufacturer's direction. I know on the Handy Quilter sewing machine and the Handy Quilter long arm, the needles both go all the way up. So very important. We want that scarf where that hook is. So you may hear people say, oh, I should turn my needle a little bit, especially if you're on a long arm and you have that round shank. That's a great ability because we can make a little adjustment, but if you turn it too far away from the hook, then you won't be able to take that stitch. So again, that scarf needs to be where it needs to be to make the stitch. And it's crazy how many times it's cycling through that as it quilts, and it still is able to do that. It's pretty amazing, actually. So we're going to kind of go into troubleshooting tension stuff, but it's super important to understand the anatomy of a stitch. And I took this screenshot and the previous one directly off Superior's website. If you want to fall down a rabbit hole of thread, needles, and tension help, it's such a great resource. In fact, in past live chats and training sessions, I've tried looking on other websites for, a more varied information, but the best information just comes from Superior Thread, so check it out. But when we're talking about tension, we're talking about, that perfect stitch. That's really where I have the same amount of pressure on the top and bottom thread. Where those threads join is right in the middle and right in the middle of our quilt sandwich. Now, if you think about that, that's not a lot of room for error. So as we start adjusting the types of threads we use, we have to make adjustments on our tension to bring it back to that equilibrium, if that makes sense. So really, in general, the only time you should have to adjust your tension is if you change the weight of thread that you're using. Now, we're not even talking about thread issues yet. That's next week. So how do you deal with breaking thread and figuring that out? But really, if your tension is set and you move to a thicker thread, you're going to have to make adjustments so that it can have that proper stitch. So understanding if I see that top thread, if that bottom thread is pulled up to the top, that means my top thread is pulling too much and I need to loosen that tension to get it to that point. Now, for those of you on a sewing machine, not every sewing machine has the ability to change the bobbin tension, and that's fine. That means all your adjustments are going to be made on the top. For those of you on a long arm, I think it's a great rule of thumb to adjust your bobbin tension to the bobbin that you have in there and then make all your final adjustments on the top. The one thing that I did when I started long arming and I didn't know what I was doing, I would tighten the top and tighten the bottom. And what is that doing? Nothing. It's that in that tug of war, it's not moving that tension at all. So making only adjustments on one side will really keep you from doing something silly like that where I'm just kind of not really helping myself there. But if we think of the other way around, which is usually the most common, the quilting looks great on the top, but we can see that top thread on the bottom. We need to tighten that top tension and pull it back up. So as you're making adjustments on your tension, you're going to follow your manufacturer's instructions. And what I would suggest is tighten a little bit or adjust a little bit and then quilt. Adjust and then quilt. You should start to see some kind of difference. If you're not seeing difference after a few times, it means that's not the problem. So just take your time. Don't do a lot of adjusting and then testing, kind of little baby steps, because it's a lot easier to fine tune it when you get to that point. Now, again, depending on the weight of thread you're using and the effect you're going for. We'll learn more about thread next time, of course. Now, when you're working with your needles, and I'll go back to my camera, that's the only pictures I have there. When you're working with your needles, go ahead and change them often. I know it's not fun. I know it's scary, especially on a long arm with that round shank, but it is important to have a nice sharp needle. If you think about it, that needle has to go through 2 layers of fabric and batting, grab that thread, get back up in place to take the next stitch. So if it's dull or bent in any little bitty way, it might not even be perceptible while you're looking at it. It's not going to make that stitch that you need. So we want it to separate the fibers of the fabric, go down and come right back up. You'll be able to tell it's dull if you're hearing a popping sound. Well, you might be able to tell if you can hear it. That popping sound means that it's actually breaking the fibers in the fabric and not dividing up through them. So again, change it often. Always a good rule of thumb, if you're having issues, go ahead and change your needle, make sure that's not the problem. Because sometimes you might hit a bulky seam, you may hit your ruler, and it might look fine, it might feel sharp, but it doesn't take much to impact that stitch. And sometimes you're looking at it, you can't even see that there's a problem, but there definitely is. I have one of my long arm owners, Tina, great tip. She writes on the side of her machine with a dry erase marker the size needle that's in it and when she last changed it. And I thought that was a great idea so that if I'm changing thread, I can remember, this is what size needle is in there. They're not very expensive, and it's a lot easier to be working with, the right equipment so that you're not dealing with tension and thread frustrations, because sometimes that is definitely the case. So I know that's a quick primer. I'm sure there's probably some questions about needles, but again, changing your needle often, making sure you're using the right size for the thread you're using, and then if you're having trouble, check out those titanium coated needles. They're a pretty good option. And of course, if you're working with a long arm, use your long arm manufacturer's needle, of course. So that's kind of the summary. I know I kind of landed that plane a little early there, Jex, but if you got any questions, I can take them for you. Okay. Perfect. All right. What's my favorite thread for long arming? I love threads, and next week you're going to find out just how much I love threads. I tell my new long armers or new machine quilters that hanging out with a 40 to 50 weight thread is kind of the sweet spot, in my opinion, because it's strong enough to deal with the quilting, but not so thin that it's finicky to deal with. Because as you start getting to the really thick or really thin threads, then you start to have to make more adjustments on that tension. So kind of hang out there. I use Glide thread, which is a 40 weight thread 90% of the time, but I love the 100 weight micro quilter. I love the holographic metallic stuff, all the specialty threads. So I like all the threads. What kind or size needle should you be using when couching yarn or chenille? If you're couching, you're basically just stitching the yarn to the fabric, right? You're going to use the needle that works with the thread that you're using. So even though we're dealing with this chunky thread that's kind of being couched on there, it's still going to stick with the size thread. So it just depends on the thread that you're using. Again, if you're having trouble shredding at the needle, it's breaking, it could be that your needle's not the right size. So you can go up or down depending. When I make adjustments, do I go up one number at a time on the dial or somewhere in between? Honestly, the more you play with the tension on your machine, the more comfortable you're going to get with this. So one of my favorite things to do, I haven't done it probably in a year or so, when I have like a boot camp training for my long arm owners, I love to get all the machines and mess up the tension and make them fix it. Because I know it can be like scary to do that on your own machine. So I'm not suggesting you mess up the tension on your machine, but I'm just saying it's good practice when you have to make those adjustments. I can usually tell how bad is this tension looking. If I'm jumping from a 40 weight Glide poly thread to 100 micro quilter, I know I'm going to have to make some bigger adjustments. So I might jump up a little bit more. So a couple numbers at a time. On the long arm, I'm going to do about a half a turn on that knob or even a full turn. So it doesn't have to be tiny, tiny bits, but I'm not going to crank it till it stops and then try quilting, if that makes sense. But if I'm only going from a 40 weight thread to a 50 weight, maybe I'm going from Glide to So Fine, and I know it's just a little bit thinner, so I know I need to make it a little bit tighter on that top tension, then I'm going to do just a tiny little amount. So the jump will determine how big we're going to do. And one thing that I should have really talked about is when we're adjusting tension, what we're really talking about is there are two discs in the long arm and the sewing machine that hold that thread. So that thread is being fed through those discs. And those discs, when we adjust tension, we're just adjusting the tightness that those discs are holding the thread. So if you think about it, if I'm using a thinner thread and I need to go to a thicker thread, I need to give it more space. I need to loosen the tension on there. If I'm going to a smaller thread, I need to tighten the tension. Again, I kind of like to use the jeans analogy because we've all been there, right? Like, these jeans are too small, but I'm trying to fit them in there, right? No, I need some bigger ones. I need a little bit more room for that thread. So when I'm making adjustments on that, that's what I'm doing, adjusting those discs right there, and that's what does that. Of course, with your machine, it may be different. And if you're a little nervous, it's always easier to correct a little mistake than a big mistake. So what you could do if you're newer to it or you're really scared, and I get it, it can be scary, keep a little note, like, okay, raised up to number whatever, depending on however your machine does it, or turn the knob a quarter of a turn. I know some long arms now, like Handy Quilters, have an easy set tension number, right? So it gives me a number. It's a 60. So I turn to a 70. Okay, still not okay. It'll give me a roadmap to back up should I be making problems for myself. Because sometimes, and we'll talk about this next week when we're dealing with tension problems, sometimes we start fixing stuff, but that's not the problem. And we have to then unfix all the things that we did. So you'll hear me say next week, threading is super important. Make sure you check your threading before you make any adjustments, whether it's, no matter what the problem is. So again, as you're working with your needles, it's super important to know what you're working with. If you have any questions about that, of course, you can leave in the comment section. I know this is kind of a quicker live chat, but next week we're going to really dive into the types of threads that are out there, why you would want to use them, what does weight mean, and then we're going to kind of pull it all together like, okay, how do we troubleshoot issues? Because if I could make a flow chart that would tell you how to fix every problem, I totally would. But the problem is that there is 100 different causes for most issues. Well, not really. That's an exaggeration. The good news is it's a small tweak, but we just have to be able to figure it out. So we'll give you some good guidelines and maybe give you some good rule of thumb to follow. If I did make a flow chart, it would just always end in drink more wine, right? Is your tension bad? Yes, drink wine. No, drink some wine until you don't care. So just know that, it's a learning curve, especially for those of you. I know I have a lot of people on my live chat that just got new long arms. It is a little bit of a learning curve, but it doesn't take as long as you might think to deal with that tension problem. So definitely looking forward to next week. Again, I know this is a quick live chat, so I love that. If you're watching later, leave your questions in the comments. Other quilters love to chime in and help as well and answer, and of course I'll get on there. Or you can always join me next Thursday at 3 p.m. Central, where we'll kind of dive even more into it. So until then, everybody, I hope you are having great weather wherever you're at. I hope you're safe, and I will see you next week for that live chat. Bye.